Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're comparing the 8-year-old mainstream GTX 1060 6GB to the modern entry-level RTX 3050 6GB. I'll be ignoring modern features that the 30 series card supports such as DLSS and ray tracing, instead focusing on native 1080p no frills performance. The 1060 6GB, or the proper 1060 as some would call it, launched in 2016 for $249 or $299 for a founder's version. It was a solid card for the money, and in the previous video I demonstrated its modern day performance, which is still pretty good considering its sub $100 or pounds price tag. The 3050 6GB shares the 3050 name, but in reality it's a completely different card to the original 8GB model. Aside from the VRAM, it has less cores and reduced bus width. It does only require PCIe slot power though, no external connector needed. I've made a comparison between the two versions of the 3050 in the past, and there are noticeable performance differences, but let's see how it fares in a side by side with what was one of the most popular graphics cards out there back in the day, the 1060. We'll start with Alan Wake 2. Keep an eye on power consumption figures as well. So Alan Wake 2 1080p with the lowest settings. I've stayed away from any forms of upscaling, as I mentioned at the start here, for a more fair comparison, and in games with a benchmark tool built in, I've used that. First of all, then we have a custom benchmark run for this one. The GTX 1060 6GB hit 32 FPS, which I think is still impressive considering the age of the card and how demanding this game is, especially at native resolution. The 1% low was 27, and the 0.1% low was 25. For the modern 3050 6GB, we saw 49 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 29. When it comes to the 3050, and this applies throughout, take a look at used prices for 8GB cards, because you can probably find a used 8GB card for the same money that you'll find a new 6GB version. I did recently feature a 6GB 3050, this one in an HP upgrade build. Kept the budget below £200, and I think in the cases where you may not want to use an adapter or upgrade the PSU, it can be an easy way to turn an old system into something decent again with minimal hassle. For Black Myth then, for the 1060 6GB, we saw 35 FPS with a 1% low of 30 and a 0.1% low of 25. The RTX card hit 44 FPS on average with a 1% low of 36 and a 0.1% figure of 28, so about 9 frames per second difference on average here, and these figures get closer as we move down through the percentile numbers. Neither card is particularly impressive here, but both results I think are playable. It's more impressive when you look at it from the 1060's point of view though, because of the age of the card. It still is just about scraping by even in these heavy modern AAA releases. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 next. This is a built-in benchmark tool as well. I'm using 1080p and the balanced preset. For the 1060, we couldn't quite hit 60 frames per second. It was 54 overall during the benchmark run. The 1% low was 32 and the 0.1% low was 27. For the RTX card, the modern entry-level RTX card, we saw 77 frames per second, so breaking through that 60 FPS threshold, we could definitely afford to go higher in terms of the graphical settings with this one. We also saw a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 35. Cyberpunk 2077 next. This is best suited to the 1060 when there is some form of upscaling. The same can be said for pretty much every other game that supports such features, and that's really going to help extend the longevity of the card, I feel. FSR, things like that, perhaps Intel XeSS in games that might not have FSR, and any other form of upscaling that may be featured. At native resolution, however, with the low preset and medium textures, we saw 48 FPS with the 1060, a 1% low of 34 and a 0.1% low of 24. Bear in mind the low preset does keep a few things on medium as well, so the game looks better than it does at the completely lowest settings, especially with a higher texture preset. The RTX 3050 6GB once again broke through that 60 FPS barrier, 71 overall, with a 1% low of 53 and a 0.1% figure of 36, so there will be some drops below 60 still. Forza Horizon 5 is pretty easy to run on both cards for a plus 60 FPS average. The 1060 managed 63 overall with a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 32. For the 3050 then, it was a much improved result of 88 frames per second. This is basically what I expected throughout the 3050 to jump ahead, but it's interesting to note that some results are a lot closer than others, and that just goes to show you that in not all instances the 3050 is clearly the more definitive winner. Some cases it is though, like here, 88, that's a jump of 25 FPS on average. The percentile lows were also a lot better too, but as I said, this is what I expected. In Red Dead Redemption 2 then, with the Xbox One X equivalent settings, the 1060 hit 57 FPS during the in-game benchmark run, a 1% low of 46 was recorded, and a 0.1% low of 31 here. For the 3050 we saw 71 frames per second, a 1% low of 56, and a 0.1% low of 36. So there will still be some dips and drops, and those 0.1% low figures aren't too different in fact, especially during busier and more intensive scenes. Let's finalise with Starfield, which of course doesn't have a built-in benchmark run, but I took a walk around New Atlantis here. Is that what it's called? I haven't played this game in a while. I really like it, but I just never have the time these days. So Starfield 1080p, lowest settings, the 1060 6GB, 36 frames per second, a 1% low of 30 and a 0.1% low of 22. The 3050 6GB pulled ahead with 49 frames per second, 13 FPS more. And the percentile figures were also improved though. Once again, that 0.1% number was only 4 frames per second higher, but in the grand scheme of things, yeah, the 3050 is the clear winner, but this was to be expected. I just wanted to compare the two out of interest to see how a modern entry-level card performs when up against an old school or near decade old mainstream card. The card that pretty much everyone I knew at the time had one or two experiences with. Loads of people were buying this. It was top of the Steam hardware survey for ages. Just a really solid card for the money, and now you can get it for less than £100 dollars. And I think for that, it's still pretty respectable, even when it comes to these newer titles. When it comes to the 3050 6GB, it's fine for upgrading an old PC. If you're looking for something without a power connector that consumes very little wattage, then yeah, it's gonna do okay, especially in titles where you can enable DLSS or FSR, for example. Seems a bit of a shame on a brand new card to have to do that, I guess, but this is entry level after all. That said, if you don't mind using the used market, then look out for 8GB 3050s, because you'll probably find one for the same price as a new 6GB card, and the 8GB card is much better. Alternatively, look out for an RX 6600 because that'll be better than both. Thanks for watching then. I hope you found this helpful or entertaining or both. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already and you want to, of course, and I'll see all of you in the next one.